Good evening. The two men vying for number 10 have been giving more details of what they would do if they became the next Prime Minister. Boris Johnson said he would take Britain out of the European Union come what may by the end of October. But Jeremy Hunt described Halloween as a fake deadline and said that was more likely to result in a general election. Mr Hunt said what mattered now was choosing the right person to become Prime Minister, warning that it must be someone trustworthy. Without trust, he said, there'd be no negotiation in Brussels, no deal and possibly no Brexit. Here's our political editor, Laura Kuenssberg.
Jeremy Hunt wants to persuade you he ought to be the next Prime Minister. He knows that means, first of all, untangling an enormous mess.
What would you do on day one in number 10 to get us out of the EU at the end of October?
Well, we have to approach this differently. It's the biggest constitutional crisis that I can remember. I would have the DUP in my negotiating team. I'd have the ERG, who are the Brexit purists. I'd have Scottish and Welsh Conservatives, because fundamentally, I believe there is a deal to be done.
What would be different about the deal you hope to achieve?
Changing the backstop, but with some guarantees that we're not going to have a hard border on the island of Ireland for completely obvious reasons. That approach is not too different to what Boris wants. I think it'll be a technology-led solution.
You are putting forward, just as Boris Johnson told us yesterday, something that the European Union has said no to on multiple occasions.
It will be a technology-led solution. I think everyone thinks that within the next decade we aren't going to have big border checks when it comes to goods, because we're going to do all these things online, just like the rest of our lives is transformed.
You won't have a deal unless there is a backstop, unless there is a credible idea ready immediately. And you're not saying it's ready immediately, you're talking about within a decade.
No, I think it is ready, but of course
now?
The EU, yes I do, but the EU have not wanted to accept this kind of solution because their hope was that we might stay in this thing called the customs union, where we have to stick to their tariffs.
What you're suggesting, Foreign Secretary, is that somehow the EU didn't listen to more creative ideas for the backstop because they wanted to keep us closer.
Well, this is a negotiation, and they obviously are going to negotiate for what is, for them, the best outcome. But the reality is we ended up with a deal that's not going to get through Parliament, and I think when I talk to people in the EU, they understand that.
Unlike Boris Johnson, you are willing to go beyond the October the 31st deadline. But for how long would you keep trying to get a deal before you say time to go for no deal?
Well, I think that 31st of October, come hell or high water deadline is a fake deadline. I think we'll know very soon, well before the 31st of October, if there is a deal to be done along the basis I've said. And if there isn't, and if no deal is still on the table, I've been very clear. I will leave the European Union without a deal, but I'm not going to do that if there's a prospect of a better deal.
You would make a decision before October the 31st on whether to leave without a deal?
That's correct. And I'm very clear that if we haven't got the prospect of a deal that can get through Parliament by that date, then that is the option I would choose.
Listening to you talking about your Brexit plans is actually very similar to talking to Boris Johnson about his Brexit plans. High on ambition, low on concrete detail.
Well, no, I've been very clear about the concrete detail, and the judgment is who is the person we trust as Prime Minister to go to Brussels and bring back that deal. It's about the personality of our Prime Minister. If you choose someone where there's no trust, there's going to be no negotiation, no deal.
You don't trust Boris Johnson? You don't think he would be trustworthy as Prime Minister?
I would never make those comments about a fellow candidate. I would serve Boris Johnson.
Hang on, Jeremy Hunt.
Let me finish. I would serve Boris Johnson to the very best of my ability.
Foreign Secretary, you've just sat there in a race of two and said this is about who we can trust, someone we can trust like me or someone we can't trust. You are clearly talking about your opponent in this race.
No, I'm saying I am trustworthy. They're sort of special occasions, are they?
Meeting veterans in Chelsea, no doubt he'll use every moment to try to win. But how would he fix what Mr Hunt admits is one of the biggest problems the government he's part of failed to fix?
This government, of which you have been part, has been talking about trying to fix social care for years and nothing has happened.
I do think that councils need more money, but it's also about personal responsibility. I think we should be a country where people save for their social care costs just in the same way they save for their pension. I think it should be something that people can opt out of, but it should be an automatic thing.
And would you put a cap on social care costs?
I'd do a deal. If you're prepared to save responsibly during your life, then we will cap those costs because you've done the right thing.
He recently raised eyebrows, saying he still believed the abortion limit should be reduced to 12 weeks, which he voted for in 2008.
If an MP put forward legislation to cut the time limit on abortion, would you vote to do that?
As Prime Minister, I wouldn't seek to change the law. I didn't as Health Secretary either. How I vote in any future private member's bill would be a matter of conscience, and I would have to see what that bill is before I made my decision.
So you might vote to cut the time limit on abortion?
Well, people have very strong views on all sides on these issues, and all I would say is that as Health Secretary, I upheld the will of Parliament. I didn't seek to change the law, but I was very honest with people about how I voted. That's a matter of public record, and it would be the same as Prime Minister.
Do you worry in this contest that you might be somehow unfairly squeezed out by someone with a bigger personality than you?
Laura, I have been waiting for this moment for 30 years of my life. I have been sitting around that cabinet table thinking how I want to transform our country.
So you want to be a Prime Minister for 30 years? When did you know?
I won't say that. I think if I say that, that's really going to put people off. But
oh, you must tell us
30
now.
years is a very, very long time, and this is Britain. But look, I would love to do this job. I think I can make a difference.
3 decades is already a long time to wait. Will Tory members keep him hanging on? Laura Kuenssberg, BBC News.
Meanwhile, Boris Johnson has been taking part in a series of broadcast interviews and public appearances just a day after Jeremy Hunt called him a coward for not taking part in a TV debate. Mr. Johnson has refused to elaborate on why police were called to the home he shares with his girlfriend last week, but he has been giving more details about his favourite pastimes, as our chief political correspondent Vicky Young reports.
I don't suppose you're members of the Conservative Party, are you?
Thank you. Back on the campaign trail, back in front of the cameras.
Are you a member of the Conservative Party?
Boris Johnson's been accused of hiding away to avoid scrutiny.
Thank you very much, thank you. I think I'm going to need it.
But after a difficult few days, he's doing what his team thinks he does best, working a crowd. Mr. Johnson, why do you think the EU will do what you want them to?
Well, because I think that it's a massive opportunity now to get this thing done, put it to bed, and allow the country to move forward.
But you need goodwill from them, don't you?
And I think there's going to be goodwill on both sides.
It's been 24 hours of interviews, speeches and visits. Mr. Johnson told the BBC yesterday that the UK would leave the EU at the end of October with or without a deal, and he'd keep back the £39 billion divorce payment.
So that's a state secret.
Today he was still fending off questions about his private life. He's been accused of staging this photo with his girlfriend after neighbours reported shouting and screaming from their flat and called the police.
It's not a state secret. So when was it taken?
It's not a state secret, it just happens to be something that I don't want to get into. Because
you won't even tell me when the picture was taken?
No, why should I?
Mr. Johnson's convinced that the public don't care about the details of his personal life, although it obviously hasn't passed them by completely.
You think so?
We thought you were the best from the word go.
Well, fantastic.
Well, we hope so, anyhow. Just don't have any more rows.
No more rows, no, all quiet, all quiet.
Well, there you
Thank
go.
you very much.
Boris Johnson's happy enough out and about in true blue Tory Surrey, but he is still refusing to do a head-to-head televised debate tonight with his rival Jeremy Hunt, and there will be many more difficult questions in the weeks ahead.
You do like a certain amount of fat in the sausages, but nice and lean, good fruit.
What would his priorities be as Prime Minister? Today brought several spending pledges, more cash for schools, police and roads. Not much detail on how to pay for it though. And some questions have produced unexpected answers. How does Mr. Johnson relax?
I make buses.
You make models of buses?
I make models of buses.
So they're going to be in Downing Street.
So
you're making
I
buses.
yeah,
you're making cardboard buses. Okay, that's what you do to enjoy yourself.
I paint the passengers enjoying themselves.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Is he being serious? Often, it's hard to tell. Vicky Young, BBC News, Surrey.
Well, in a moment we will speak to our Europe editor Katia Adler, but first let's talk to Laura Kuenssberg in Westminster. And Jeremy Hunt very much trying to make this personal now.
He is, Sophie. I mean, the power in this race, even though he's been buffeted around, has been with Boris Johnson. The criticisms of Jeremy Hunt have been that he's too safe, too dull, too boring. He doesn't have the kind of flash and dash and charisma of Mr. Johnson. But his answer to that now, I think, is very clearly that he's going to sharpen up his attacks on the controversial former Foreign Secretary. And although he was very careful to insist he wasn't attacking Mr. Johnson personally, he wasn't saying, oh, of course you can't trust him. When it comes down to a race with two candidates and one of them says, I'm the one who can be trusted and we mustn't have anybody we cannot trust, it doesn't take a genius to work out the message that he is trying to send. It's absolutely clear Mr. Hunt is trying to push at the bruise of the doubts that some Tory MPs, many Tory members and many members of the public have about Boris Johnson's character and his temperament, and whether it really is sensible to believe what he's promising going into number 10, he hopes. That said, let's have a reality check. Both of the men are putting forward proposals that they cannot guarantee would buy them support in Brussels. They cannot guarantee that their ideas would then get through Parliament if the EU guarantees. And one senior Tory said to me tonight, with some irritation perhaps, they are both living in the same fantasy land. The difference is that Mr. Hunt is suggesting he would be a nicer person to make a mess of Brexit.
And Katya, both men making it clear that they are prepared to leave without a deal. How worried is the EU about that?
Well, let me just say, Sophie, EU leaders aren't right now on the edge of the seat biting their nails, and that's partly because of time. Right now, it's summer. The current Brexit extension runs out on the 31st of October. That's light years away in terms of politics for the EU. But also, Sophie, just as Jeremy Hunt and Boris Johnson don't take the EU at its word that it will never, ever renegotiate the Brexit withdrawal agreement, the EU doesn't take them at their word that they really would be likely to trigger a no-deal Brexit by the 31st of October. And this centres around two EU theories that I'm hearing. Number one, about ambition, particularly surrounding Boris Johnson. EU diplomats say to me he seems like someone who has wanted for so long to be the UK's Prime Minister. Would he, or Mr. Hunt for that matter, really risk their premiership after just a couple of months in Downing Street by pushing through a no-deal Brexit that Parliament and some MPs in their own party may oppose? And the second theory is about practicalities, because if the new UK Prime Minister does manage to engage the EU in new Brexit talks come the autumn, no one here in Brussels think they could be concluded by the 31st of October. So would the new UK Prime Minister throw those talks away to push through the no-deal Brexit? The EU thinks it's much more likely, whatever Jeremy Hunt and Boris Johnson say now, that the new UK Prime Minister will probably ask for a second Brexit extension. From the EU point of view, pushing that threat of a no-deal Brexit that much further down the road.